Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit and give you a little information that I used to use in my classes with my students, talking about the formation of the United States. It's a fascinating story, and so much of our understandings of our government are not known, or we don't really care to know them, and we haven't gone out of our way in many respects with our teachers or with our educators to tell us about this. And so I want to get into a little bit more detail about it, not too much, not to make it uncomfortable. And I use this from my stuff from my classes from years ago. We fought a revolution, and the revolution was influenced by many factors. We had talked to England for representation. They had just fought a war on our behalf to keep the French out, and now they said we should pay for it, and we didn't want to, and that's not exactly a smart thing to do, but we did it anyway. And we argued with the British government about the taxes that were presented to us. We had something called the Boston Massacre, which wasn't a massacre at all. It was a riot in which a bunch of thugs with clubs and snowballs, and in the middle of the snowballs were rocks, of course, throwing at these soldiers that were against the wall and terrified. And then they kept screaming, "Fire, fire, fire." And finally somebody, either by accident or whatever, fired a gun and they went off. And a few people died. Was it that soldier's fault? Not really. They were being attacked. This was a riot. If you've seen the pictures of the Boston Massacre, they look rather content in shooting the people. That's not at all what happened. It was a riot. And the people that were the focus of that riot to hurt were the soldiers. John Adams came to their defense. This is a very important thing. Honest John, as he was known, he was a lawyer, and he said, "I won't see this. I will defend them." And he defended them, and he got them away from the gallows. They were not found guilty of the murder, because what had happened was an insurrection, a riot against law. And John Adams saw it. Everybody hated him for it, but he was right. And this led to a bloody revolution, starting in Boston. And of course, Boston, that's when they sent George Washington to Boston to run the troops. But who nominated George Washington? John Adams. You see, it's a brilliant strategy to connect these colonies. And that's what John Adams did. If he sat there and gave the job to John Hancock, who really wanted it would remain a New England affair. He understood that the only way to survive a revolution like this is to create an atmosphere of togetherness. And so he went for the most powerful of our colonies, Virginia. He asked George Washington to be the commander. Of course, he came to every meeting dressed in military uniform, which kind of said he wanted the job. And then, of course, later, after that, he went to Thomas Jefferson and said, "Would you write our Declaration?" He was a Virginian. This brought Virginia completely into the whole thing. And not to mention Richard Henry Lee, who was sent by Adams and Franklin and a few others to get a resolution from the House of Delegates. And he got it. In fact, the Declaration was based on Lee's resolution, a fact that we don't talk about. And we fought our war. It was dreadful. The only way we could win that war was to basically survive it, and that's what we did. Fortunately, the French came to our aid, and when Yorktown took place, the reason why we won Yorktown was because the French were with us on the land and the French were with us on the sea. And General Washington was there. And they got the surrender of Cornwallis. And that basically led to the end of the American Revolution. The revolution was not won by us, but by surviving, we won. As we will find out many, many years later, in situations like Vietnam and things like that, we could not win, and they won by basically surviving. It's exactly what we did in the American Revolution. George Washington gathered his soldiers together, his generals, and basically surrendered his sword. And he became our Cincinnatus. Of course, Cincinnatus is the famous general in Roman history who retired and became a farmer, and that was it. And so Washington was gone. And while the revolution was going on, we had created our first constitution called the Articles of Confederation. And it was a complete opposite of the government that we had been with, the British Empire, which had a strong central government. And in this case, we had 13 individual countries and a very, very weak, impotent central government. And that central government couldn't do much of anything, but the 13 countries could do a lot. You notice I say countries and not states, because they consider themselves countries. Each had their own militia, their military. Each had their own coinage, money system. Each had their own duties and tariffs and ambassadors in which they were sending to Europe and to other states to work out and broker deals. Problem was, a lot of these countries didn't get along with the others. It was the European Union, as it is today. You can hear them bickering and fighting a lot. Each one wanted to be in control. And everyone saw the country falling apart. And so it was suggested that we have a gathering to fix the Articles of Confederation. And there was a hijacking. 4 individuals, 2 New Yorkers and 2 Virginians, George Washington and James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And I'll tell you something, I got the opportunity to study a lot of John Jay's papers at Columbia University. It's brilliant stuff. He is very, very important in this whole period of time, and we hardly hear about him. But I think that's going to change, I imagine. I've seen a lot of papers that are stating that they're going to start releasing a lot of stuff about him, and it should prove very interesting. And so they went to this convention in Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation. They had had another gathering before, and that went nowhere. And finally, if I may say, they got together in Philadelphia and they fixed the situation in a way that's very unique. In fact, the 4 individuals did not come to fix the Articles of Confederation. They scrapped it. And a lot of people were really upset about this, and a number of people left the convention. Patrick Henry was absolutely upset about the fact that if we created a central government, it could tax us without our representation or our desire. And so things got ugly for a while, and the 4 finally took over the whole convention. They hijacked it, and we started a constitution. That's how our Constitution started. It wasn't started as a Constitution. It was basically a cabal. It was basically a coup d'etat on our present operating system. And therefore, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay pushed to develop a Constitution. And they had some wonderful people that worked with them. Gouverneur Morris is one very important person in that. He helped rewrite the whole thing. And of course, Jefferson didn't want anything to do with the Constitution. John Adams did. In fact, a lot of the Constitution that exists today is based upon the Constitution of Massachusetts. Who wrote that? John Adams by himself in 5 days. It's still in effect. But basically what he created was a small model of what our Constitution would become. But we never gave him one iota of credit, which is really a pity. And the Constitution was voted upon. I mean, they made a deal. Here's the interesting part about our Constitution. Our Constitution only needed 9 votes to pass. There were 13 states, only 9 needed to pass it. That's the rule they came up with. They came up with that rule because they had 4 states that were problematic. So they did it that way. And interestingly enough, they got their 9 votes. In fact, they got 10. And the others were dragged along, and certainly not very happily. One thing that could not be mentioned in the Constitution, nor could it be mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, was slavery. Slavery had to be handled in a very different manner. Because had we tried to remove slavery, we wouldn't have been able to get a Constitution. And you can only do one layer at a time, unfortunately. Sometimes you got to sit there and, sit with the devil and talk to them. But that's what we had to do. That's what had to be done. And we had a Constitution, we had a government, and we had a president in 1789. George Washington was our first president. Here was our Cincinnatus, who had retired after the war. Then he was dragged back to the Constitutional Convention with that quartet of 4 people, 2 from New York, 2 from Virginia. And it's interesting because he didn't want to go. And finally they pushed him along and he said, I will go reluctantly. He would always use that term. And our Cincinnatus came again. Then Cincinnatus retired. And then in 1789, Cincinnatus was called again. And he accepted reluctantly. That was a favorite word of Washington, by the way. He would always, I will accept reluctantly. Now, let's translate reluctantly. Hot damn. I mean, he wanted to do that. Washington so much wanted to retire, but he so much wanted to be where the action was. And it's an interesting point to see that after his administration, he started going a little crazy because he wasn't part of the action. He had truly become our Cincinnatus. And that beginning with George Washington and John Adams as our first president and vice president took that Constitution that was a hijacked item from the Articles of Confederation and created a nation. Remarkably, people screamed and hollered, and of course what they had to do was to come up with a Bill of Rights, which James Madison wrote pretty much by himself, which is pretty incredible. And all of the states could send in ideas for amendments. And I think after they got rid of all the duplicates, it was well over 100. And James Madison, more or less himself, put them all together and came down to 10. And there we start our government. From questioning moments in the time of the American Revolution, questioning times in the time of the Constitution, where we weren't quite sure if we could agree to disagree. And then the frightening moment when we embarked upon that skiff of paper, which was the Constitution, in New York City, our first capital. And it worked. That's enough for now. I've kind of talked quite a bit, but when you think of Adams, when you think of Washington, when you think of so many people from that period of time, John Jay, for instance, remember they gave everything. And Washington, and most of all, the one that gets left out of the sauce so often, is John Adams. He was our Atlas of Independence. He was the one that pushed Washington forward to become general. He's the one that pushed Jefferson to do the Declaration of Independence and wouldn't forgive himself for the rest of his life for doing that, and tried to basically bring everyone together to create a nation. And although we had not truly become a nation, we were a confederacy, kind of. And that wouldn't change until after, quite a bit after, Washington's administration, and not completely till the American Civil War, when we get the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and things change drastically. And we totally reconstruct this country. So, some lines from class that I used to do, I figured I'd share them with you, about 2 future presidents and the beginnings of our government. Thank you.